It has long been accepted that time waits for no one, but perhaps it lingers slightly longer for some. Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity reversed a number of Isaac Newton's assumptions about the nature of the universe. Historian Jim Holt, writing for Latham's Quarterly, reveals that Newton saw the heavens as a sort of cosmic grandfather clock, one that hovered over the rest of nature in blithe autonomy. And he believed that time advanced at a smooth and constant rate from past to future. The invention of quantum mechanics altered the way that physicists perceive time. Psychologist Lisa Broderick explains for us the block universe theory, writing that just as all space is laid out all at once, all time is also. The block universe theory contends that everything has already happened and will happen, so no now can be more important than any other. The entirety of time has already been laid out, even though the concept may be beyond our comprehension. This also suggests that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only an illusion. Those that ponder with questions about time often wonder whether we flow through time or whether time moves through us. Although time travels at the speed of light, we experience it differently from moment to moment. Einstein's easy way of explaining this was to point out that an hour with a pretty girl on a park bench passes in a minute, while a minute on a hot stove feels like an hour. Holt explains it as, old people are being rushed forward into the future at a cruelly rapid clip. When you're an adult, as Fran Lebowitz once observed, Christmas seems to come every 5 minutes. For little children, however, time goes quite slowly. Owing to the endless novelty of a child's experience, a single summer can stretch out into an eternity. Time has a few other oddities. A contemporary of Einstein at Princeton, Kurt Gödel, theorized that it was possible for individuals, via a long enough round-trip space journey, to revisit their own past in a form of a space travel akin to what Christopher Nolan portrayed in the movie Interstellar. Gödel presented his findings to Einstein as a present for his 70th birthday. The fact that Gödel's conclusions were based upon Einstein's own theory made the birthday boy question his own work anew. That would be considered a punishment for everyone else, but a true gift nonetheless to Albert. Time is also affected by gravity, especially near black holes, which are the largest gravitational forces within the universe. The effect is real on Earth, although not nearly as noticeable. Holt reveals that since time is warped by gravity, the stronger the gravitational field, the slower the clock hands creep. If you live in a ground floor apartment, you age a trifle less rapidly than your neighbor in the penthouse. The unstoppable march of time was on Einstein's mind when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was 60 years old and knew that his chances for another breakthrough were declining with each passing hour. He suffered from multiple chronic illnesses, rarely exercised, and ate inconsistently. His life's work had been to figure out the mysteries of nature itself, to prove once and for all that God does not play dice with the world. Although he had taken huge steps towards answering a number of life's mysteries, far more questions remained unanswered. However he experienced it, his time on Earth was running out. He still had a lot to learn. Unfortunately, in the words of the French composer Hector Berlioz, time is a great teacher, but unfortunately it kills all its pupils. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about the man who remains synonymous with the term genius, Albert Einstein. Episode number 6, Aging Like a Fine Wine. Upon reaching his 66th birthday, Albert Einstein officially retired from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. In reality, however, only his title changed, as he continued to work on campus in the exact same manner as he had when the university was paying him. Historian Ronald Clark, our main source for this series, sets the stage for Einstein's final decade, noting that in Palestine, it was becoming more and more clear that the British would be unable to hold Arabs and Jews apart much longer, and a question mark hung over what was to follow the mandate. Dominating everything, there loomed the riddle of Russia's intentions and the grim thought that the worst of American and British suspicions might be justified. E equals MC squared, and the 1939 letter to President Roosevelt came from the man whose reputation in science had once been equaled by his position as an avowed pacifist. The outcome was inevitable. Almost overnight, Einstein became the conscience of the world. As such, he wrote, spoke, and broadcast throughout the 10 years that remained to him. His attitude to all that had passed before August 6, 1945, was virtually limited to 2 points. The claim that his only action had been to sign a single letter to Roosevelt, and his statement that he had known about the Frank Memorandum, pleading that the bomb should not be used on Japan without warning. Then he would have supported it. Instead of holding an inquest on the past, he looked for the future. Most historians believe that the atomic bombs had been dropped less for the sake of winning the war against Japan and more for sending a clear signal to the Soviet Union. President Truman casually mentioned that the weapons existed to Joseph Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. The Man of Steel's only reaction was to reply that he hoped the U.S. would make good use of it against the Japanese. Surprise was never on the table, as the Soviet spies embedded within the Manhattan Project had provided regular updates for the Russian High Command. Although there were a fair share of disagreements, the Soviet Union were faithful allies of the United States against Nazi Germany. They were far less helpful regarding Japan, as they dallied at every turn, a charge that they could easily have slung at the U.S. in 1942. A number of scientists in America sought to provide information on the atomic bombs as a show of friendship and trust amongst allies. Einstein wasn't among this group, instead arguing in favor of forming a world government. In the aging physicist's mind, only a government which derived legitimacy from nations across the globe ought to have the ability to destroy the world. Although he endorsed the newly formed United Nations as the successor to the failed League of Nations, he privately worried that the United Nations didn't have enough authority to adequately ensure world peace. His premonition would prove to be accurate, as the 5 victors of World War II claimed permanent veto power. However, the United States, England, and France are rarely on the same page as Russia and China, their former allies on the Security Council. The fact that any one of them can issue a veto over any United Nations action has rendered the organization ineffective at ensuring global peace. One of the UN's own landing pages reveals that although the absolute number of war deaths has been declining since 1946, conflict and violence are currently on the rise, with many conflicts today waged between non-state actors such as political militias, criminal and international terrorist groups. In 2016, more countries experienced violent conflict than at any point in almost 30 years. Einstein wrote in 1945 that the world government which he proposed would have power over all military matters, and need have only one further power: the power to intervene in countries where a majority is oppressing a minority and creating the kind of instability that leads to war. He pointed to Spain and Argentina as the 2 nations which he would expect such an organization to immediately intervene. His ideas were utopian and thus doomed to failure. As a backstop, he helped to form the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In 1947, the journal created the Doomsday Clock, a barometer for how close humanity is to the precipice of destruction. In 2023, the clock moved within 90 seconds to midnight due to the breakdown in the international order, as well as the continuing lack of action on cataclysmic climate change. The furthest from midnight that the clock ever moved was a whopping 17 minutes to midnight in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union gave birth to hopes that the American unilateral moment would make the world a better place. The University of Chicago attempts to reassure listeners regarding the clock to Armageddon, reminding us that Bulletin members have constantly emphasized that the clock is not intended to make people fearful, but rather to spur them to action. It is the canary in the coal mine. Einstein's calls for world government rankled conservatives within the US government, foreshadowing Einstein getting caught up in the McCarthy-era communist witch hunts. But even if he would have been aware of this future block of time, Albert wouldn't have stopped speaking his truth to power. He expressed his thoughts on the need to use his voice in a message written for the World Congress of Intellectuals in 1948, writing that, "We have learned that rational thinking does not suffice to solve the problems of our social life. We scientists, whose tragic destiny it has been to help make the methods of annihilation ever more gruesome and more effective, must consider it our solemn and transcendent duty to do all in our power in preventing these weapons from being used for the brutal purpose for which they were invented. What task could possibly be more important to us? What social aim could be closer to our hearts?" Operation Paperclip. That operation recruited German scientists to work on sensitive defense operations in America. This crop of immigrants differed from Einstein's wave, as that grouping had contained multiple geniuses coming to America to escape Nazi Germany. This new crop of more than 1,600 scientists were the ones who had worked on VX rockets and invented synthetic rubber. It included Otto Ambros, who was the very last man to depart Auschwitz before it was liberated, destroying evidence of the Nazi crimes as the tanks rolled through the barbed wire. It included Walter Schreiber, the Nazis' Surgeon General, who was slated to be found guilty of war crimes for his work with biological warfare at the Nuremberg trials. These men were actively recruited from Germany in fear that the Soviet Union would recruit them. Just months after the dropping of the bombs, the United States had co-opted Hitler's war machine in preparation for the next fight. Hoping to add his name to their new scientific institute, a group of Jewish residents attempted to lure him to Palestine. But Albert Einstein politely shrugged them off, believing that he was far too old to travel such a long distance. On February 14, 1947, Britain handed off the territory of Palestine to the United Nations, which on November 29th approved a partition plan. The Anti-Defamation League explains that the UN recommended the division of the British Mandate-controlled area of Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem to be an international city. According to the plan, the two states, roughly equal in size and natural resources, would cooperate on major economic issues, sharing their currency, roads, and government services over the territory. Regarding his people's ancestral homeland, Einstein had, as early as 1938, argued that it was essential for Jewish immigrants to consider the Arab viewpoint in regards to every action that they took. It once again displayed Einstein's utopian mindset, as he advocated that the area could become a center of culture for all Jews, a refuge for the most grievously oppressed, a field of action for the best among us, a unifying ideal, and a means of obtaining inward health for the Jews of the world. Yet in his mind, it would not be a declared Jewish state unless the Arabs wished it to be so. To an extent, he knew that it was wishful thinking, declaring that I should much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state. David Ben-Gurion didn't share the same viewpoint, leading the way for the unilateral declaration of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. The Soviet Union and United States led the way in offering recognition of the newly declared state, and a number of British officers ripped the Union Jack off of their uniforms in order to remain and defend the new state against the immediate, yet unorganized Arab backlash. When push came to shove, Albert sided with the creators of the new Jewish state, writing a letter to be auctioned off to help the cause, which proclaims that no one respects or bothers about those who do not fight for their rights. We may regret that we have to use methods which are repulsive and stupid to us, methods of which the human race has not yet been able to free itself. But to help bring about better conditions in the international sphere, we must first of all maintain our existence by all means at our disposal. Not much has changed in the Levant since this initial seizure, regrettable as it was in the eyes of Einstein. Since its formation, the State of Israel has repeatedly displayed a bunker mentality, arming themselves to the teeth to keep their perceived enemies at bay. The horrific Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7, 2023 unleashed a series of Israeli offensives which appear to at least contain individual acts of genocide. Note that supporters of the Palestinians in Gaza would argue that Israel's actions are purposeful genocide, as would be the plan that President Donald Trump floated 1 month into his second term. That insane idea called for America to take ownership of the Gaza Strip in order to turn it into a tourist destination, one denied to the Palestinians who have called it home for generations. I truly can think of no policy that would result in more terrorist attacks against the American homeland. In 1948, Einstein spoke out against a significantly smaller Jewish-led terror attack on the Arabs, and assuredly, if he were alive today, he would have spoken out against the Palestinian offensive, as well as the heavy-handed Israeli response, which only reinforces a bunker mentality that pushes away an eventual two-state solution. One can only hypothesize what the physicists would have said regarding an American administration that has showcased nothing but disdain for the scientific community and international norms. Historian Martin Indyk took to the Foreign Affairs magazine to express his hope that something positive can come out of the situation, writing that, in the wake of the monstrous attack Hamas launched on Israel on October 7th and the grievous war that Israel has waged on the Gaza Strip ever since, the allegedly dead two-state solution has been resurrected. The call for a return to the two-state paradigm has been echoed by leaders across the Arab world, the countries of the EU, middle powers such as Australia and Canada, and even Washington's main rival, China. With Hamas desiring the destruction of Israel and the Israeli far-right's plan to deport the Palestinians, the two-state solution is the last workable plan standing. When he wasn't consumed with foreign affairs, Einstein dealt with the intrusive communist witch hunts led by Joseph McCarthy. Rather than focusing on literal fascists working for the American defense industry, the senator from Wisconsin chose to focus his political capital on the pacifist Jew who had warned the world of the consequences of Hitler's rise. Einstein advised a number of men who found themselves beneath the bright lights of the publicly televised hearings. He also used his stature to speak out against what he perceived to be the deliberate censoring of science, claiming that the threat to academic freedom in our time must be seen in the fact that, because of the alleged external danger to our country, freedom of teaching, mutual exchange of opinions, and freedom of press and other media of communication are encroached upon or obstructed. He encouraged those who sought his advice to invoke the political musings of Gandhi in an act of non-compliance with the government. The physicist wrote that they are now proceeding to suppress the freedom of teaching. I can only see the revolutionary way of non-cooperation in the sense of Gandhi's. Every intellectual who is called before one of the committees ought to refuse to testify. Although he sought to help others, he ended up being crushed beneath the prevailing nationalistic viewpoint that was present within this early stage of the Cold War. The Washington Post claimed that he had proved once more that geniuses in science are no guarantee of wisdom in political affairs. The Chicago Daily Tribune claimed that it is always astonishing to find a man of great intellectual power in some directions is a simpleton or even a jackass in others. And the Colorado-based Pueblo Star-Journal climbed atop its soapbox to wrongly claim that he, of all people, should know better. This country protected him from Hitler. He, of course, did know better, later proclaiming that America had come a long way towards the establishment of a fascist regime, noting that the similarity of general conditions here to those in the Germany of 1932 are quite obvious. He even considered leaving the United States for good, but as Clark notes, however deep his misgivings about America, however strongly he at times felt that the lunatic fringe was in control, he privately retained some faith that the country would eventually solve its dilemmas without the episodes of self-destruction which seemed such a recurrent feature in German history. The Miller Center tells us that the public fears expressed by the physicists were valid, for McCarthy's shrieking denunciations and fear-mongering created a climate of fear and suspicion across the country. No one dared tangle with the senator for fear of being labeled disloyal. Einstein was so bruised by his repeated encounters with the House Un-American Activities Committee that he proclaimed in an interview with the reporter that if I would be a young man again and had to decide how to make my living, I would not try to become a scientist or scholar or teacher. I would rather choose to be a plumber or a peddler in the hope to find that modest degree of independence still available under present circumstances. That thought cuts deep for social studies educators in 2025. As parents and politicians seek more control over what is taught in the classroom, history teachers are urged to always teach both sides of every issue. The National Education Association lists 19 states that have laws on the books related to how topics related to racism, sexism, and the LGBTQ+ community are taught. In an extreme case, one Texas school district was forced to apologize after it revealed that their administrators had informed their social studies teachers that they must include opposing views on the Holocaust. To which any history educator would take to mean that we have to present the Nazis' arguments as to why the Holocaust was a legitimate undertaking. Outside influence such as this makes it really hard to suggest to anyone that they should take up the critically important profession of teaching. For those that are looking to fight back, I would suggest you invoke the spirit of Einstein's thought that I want to suggest that the practices of those ignoramuses who use their public positions of power to tyrannize over professional intellectuals must not be accepted by intellectuals without a struggle. McCarthy's witch hunt came to an end after the Eisenhower administration decided to push back. Executive privilege was invoked to starve his committee of the witnesses that they craved, and evidence was produced to discredit the work that McCarthy had previously done. In 1954, his fellow senators turned on him, condemning him by a vote of 67 to 22. Within 3 years, he had died from alcohol abuse. Einstein turned 70 in 1949, desperately working towards a solution to his long sought-after unified field theory. He admitted to his physicist friend Max Born that he was unlikely to succeed, telling him that I am, however, not yet firmly convinced that it can really be achieved with a continuous field theory, although I have discovered a possible way of doing this which so far seems quite reasonable. The difficulties of calculation are so great that I will be biting the dust long before I myself can be fully convinced of it. But I am quite convinced that someone will eventually come up with a theory whose objects connected by laws are not probabilities, but considered facts, as was until recently taken for granted. He was visited by a group of displaced European children on the day before his birthday celebration. One of them happened to be a distant cousin, whom he had the pleasure of meeting for the first time. He gave them a tour of the institute, sat with them for a picture, and handed out boxes of chocolates to them. Since 1941, Albert Einstein had used the power of his name to help relocate displaced children. He described the work in a letter, writing that, torn away from parental care and love, thrown from country to country, from place to place, delivered out to senseless persecution, having to face the dreadful confinement of a concentration camp. Efforts to save these children must not slacken. I therefore turn to you with the urgent plea to keep the problem of the evacuation of the refugee children in the forefront of your attention. That important work continues to this day, with the United Nations proclaiming that by the end of 2022, conflict and violence had resulted in the displacement of 43.3 million children worldwide. The next day, his actual birthday, he sat all day in the lecture hall listening to a series of papers. Now entering his 7th decade on Earth, he was asked if he found it tiring. He quipped that they would have been tiring if I had understood them. Although the world of quantum mechanics, one which he birthed but rejected, had overtaken him, he continued to be one of the sharpest minds on the planet, regularly combating with the intellectual heavyweights of the time. That year, he published his first scientific work in decades, titled A Generalized Theory of Gravitation. The paper provided a new tool to help figure out the unified field theory which continued to elude Albert. Unfortunately, it remains to this day untested. In 1952, Einstein received an offer out of the blue to become the second president of the State of Israel. The job was largely ceremonial, and thus Albert's name made some sense. The Prime Minister justified his approach by stating that the presidency in Israel is a symbol. It carries with it no power. I thought to myself, if we are looking for a symbol, why not have the most illustrious Jew in the world, and possibly the greatest man alive, Einstein? Albert, of course, refused, citing both his advanced age as well as the fact that supporting the militarized state of Israel would present a moral conflict of interests for the self-avowed pacifist. Still, it is interesting to imagine if we would be any closer to a two-state solution if the physicists had chosen to accept. In his official rejection of the offer, the non-religious Einstein proclaimed that "My relationship to the Jewish people has become my strongest human bond, ever since I became fully aware of our precarious situation among the nations of the world." He worked on and off through the next 5 years, and as his 75th birthday approached, he explained to anyone willing to listen that the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reasons for existence. One cannot help but be in awe when one contemplates the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one tries merely to comprehend a little of this mystery each day. Never lose a holy curiosity. To the people living near Princeton, he remained a curious fellow. As we have mentioned before, Albert didn't care at all for anything extraneous. He never wore socks, because, as he explained, they are unnecessary. He even had the beginnings of a Jerry Seinfeld observational comedy routine, asking gaping onlookers once the rhetorical question of, "What use are socks?" before supplying the punchline that they only produce holes. Benjamin Cohen is the author of the book Einstein Effect, which attempts to apply the lessons of Albert's life to our own. Rule number 1 is to expend your efforts on the things that matter. Rather than adapting to meet the needs of others, Einstein wore simple yet functional clothing that put himself at ease in the name of efficiency. Imagine how much time would be saved in your daily routine if you didn't have to find a pair of matching socks each morning. Cutting down on simple decisions helps to reduce the mental effort that is associated with decision fatigue, where your ability to make good decisions degrades as we become more tired from relentlessly having to make choices. Einstein never learned how to drive a car, complaining that it is too complicated, and was over 50 when he first handled a camera. Although he occasionally used one, typewriters seemed to baffle the genius. He had a built-in laziness, according to Clark, who quotes the physicist as stating that he loved sailing because it is the sport which demands the least energy. He slept 10 hours a day and took a plethora of short naps throughout the day. To ensure that they remained short, he would often recline in his armchair with a spoon in his hand and a metal plate directly beneath, so that when he drifted off, the sound of the falling spoon would wake him up. The BBC points out that more sleep produces spindle events, which result in a surge of electrical energy generated by the rapid firing of structures deep in the brain. Thus, while asleep, our brains can oftentimes lead us to the result that eluded us during our waking hours. This school of thought believes Einstein's explanation that his breakthrough for the theory of special relativity derived from a dream about cows getting electrocuted while jumping over a fence. Scientific geniuses all have their quirks. The BBC article tells us that Nikola Tesla believed his superior brain power came from the 100 times he squished his toes before bed each night. Sir Isaac Newton practiced celibacy to unlock his mind, while Pythagoras merely abstained from beans on the belief that that unlocked his ability to produce the Pythagorean theorem. But perhaps the oddest quirk of them all belongs to American founding father Benjamin Franklin, who swore by the power of naked air baths. Despite his difficulties living in modernity, Albert Einstein was able to empathize with the common man. Clark tells us about one dinner party during which Einstein rose silently from his chair just before the meal was to be served. He went outside and came back with the chauffeur, whom he seated beside himself for the duration of the meal. He once professed, "How strange is the lot of us mortals. Each of us is here for a brief sojourn. For what purpose he knows not, though he sometimes thinks he senses it. But without deeper reflection, one knows from daily life that one exists for other people. First of all, for those upon whose smiles and well-being our own happiness is wholly dependent. And then for the many, unknown to us, to whose destinies we are bound by the ties of sympathy. 100 times every day I remind myself that my inner and outer life are based on the labors of other men, living and dead, and that I must exert myself in order to give in the same measure as I have received and am still receiving." As his time was coming to an inevitable end, he aided others who wished to tell his story, including the moments of profound weakness as well as his greatest triumphs. One of his greatest faults was remaining within the confines of matrimony. Einstein had a number of affairs, something he admitted in writing to a female friend who sought the genius's solace upon finding out that her husband was cheating on her. The physicist's not so comforting words were that, "I am sure you know that most men, as well as quite a number of women, are not monogamously endowed by nature." National Geographic informs us that after marrying Elsa, he started a passionate affair with his secretary, Betty Newman, and in letters even fantasized about having her live with him and Elsa in a big house. When his lover dismissed the idea, he admitted that she had more appreciation for the difficulties of triangular geometry than I. In another letter, he reveals his philosophy that one should do what one enjoys and won't harm anyone else. He did, however, express some regret towards the end of his life, consoling the son of his college best friend, stating that, "What I admire in your father is that for his whole life he stayed with only one woman. That is a project in which I grossly failed, twice." Weaknesses such as this can easily be exploited by nefarious actors. When his beloved second wife was in a state of steady downward decline, his head was turned by Margarita Konakova, the spouse of a Russian sculptor who was awarded the job of making a bronze bust of Einstein for Princeton. No one's quite sure whether the affair began before Elsa passed away, but it lasted for a decade. She was 20 years younger and made the first move, inviting the 63-year-old physicist to spend a weekend away with her. That isn't the scandalous part of the story, however. For in 1995, it was discovered that Margarita was a Soviet spy working beneath the codename Lucas. Her task was to get close to prominent scientists that she met while hanging around the halls of Princeton, and according to the history collection, to pay special attention to scientists who were believed to be involved in the Manhattan Project. Incredibly, despite their long association, there is no evidence that Margarita ever managed to pry anything useful out of Einstein. In 1955, he was invited to Berlin in order to celebrate the 50th anniversary of his general theory. He refused based upon the difficulty of travel at his age, and because, in his words, anything resembling a personality cult has always been distasteful to me. Likely in the back of his mind was also the desire to continue avoiding Germany. He never forgave the country of his youth, writing to Max Born in 1950 that all human beings are more or less the same from birth. The Germans, however, have a far more dangerous tradition than any of the other so-called civilized nations. 4 years earlier, he had been invited to rejoin the Bravian Academy. In his rejection of the honor, he coldly stated that the Germans slaughtered my Jewish brethren. I will have nothing further to do with them, not even with a relatively harmless academy. He held true to those words in his life, but I can't help but wonder what he thinks about the Germany of today, which is counterintuitively one of the strongest nations in Europe while remaining the least militaristic. Clark tells us that Einstein's friends believed that maybe a few more years removed would have made the difference in softening his tone, but debates on the matter inevitably ended whenever someone suggested around him that Americans had demonstrated in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki that in sheer speed of extermination they surpassed even the Nazis. The difference in his mind would have been why each side upped their body count. One was done in efforts to maintain a free world, while the other was done purely out of hatred. In 1955, Einstein's history of stomach pain reared its ugly head during a particularly dangerous moment for Israel, which was dealing with an aggressive Egypt supported by Soviet arms sales. In response to public reporting on the issue, Einstein released the provocative statement that the Eisenhower administration was seeking to win the sympathy of the Arab nations by sacrificing Israel. His opinion on the situation resulted in his selection to deliver an Israeli Independence Day broadcast. Those that heard the early draft remember the physicists explaining that the big problem in our time is the division of mankind into two hostile camps, the communist world and the so-called free world. He experienced extreme pain while hunched over the desk perfecting the speech. 2 days later, it was discovered that he had a small leakage of blood from a hardened aorta. Surgery was put at a 50-50 chance of improving the situation, but the professor was opposed to the procedure. Perhaps remembering that time wasn't linear yet lived all at once, he stated to those around his bedside that the end comes sometime. Doesn't matter when? Upon being transferred to a recovery room, he made the request for his glasses so that he could get some work done. It was at this moment that he explained his final wishes to his friends and remaining family before passing away a few moments after midnight on April 18, 1955. The 76-year-old didn't want his house to become a museum, nor did he want it published where his ashes were, scattered for fear that it would become a tourist site. He was happy to donate his brain to science, but according to Radio Canada, the family demanded that it doesn't become a spectacle, an object of worship and public curiosity. That request, however, created an entirely different spectacle, one which wouldn't be revealed for another decade. Princeton's Dr. Thomas Harvey, a pathologist by trade, performed the autopsy and secreted away the patient's brain. From there, he quietly guarded the brain, taking it with him from job to job, city to city, stashed away in an anonymous cardboard box, attempting to find a neuroscientist worthy of studying the specimen. Carolyn Abraham, who wrote the story up for the Globe and Mail, recalls being told that Harvey had attempted to declare his package at customs, but they didn't believe him and just waved him across the border. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation produced a documentary in 2023 based upon the truly bizarre contents of the book Possessing Genius, the Bizarre Odyssey of Einstein's Brain. Throughout the rest of his life, Harvey would distribute portions of the genius's brain to scientists whom he personally considered worthy of scientifically studying it. If that isn't bizarre enough, Harvey commissioned a painting of the brain sliced into 240 chunks. The story didn't end well for the bizarre scientist, as he lost his job at Princeton, his medical license, and his marriage due to his obsession with the relic. What came of all of it? The brain was lighter than normal, and Harvey described it unscientifically as different looking than most. Experimental Neurology published a definitive study in 1985 that showed the genius to have an above-average amount of glial cells, which keep the neurons in the brain oxygenated and therefore engaged. A 1996 University of Alabama at Birmingham study added that these neurons were more tightly packed than usual, and thus possibly better at processing information. Albert Einstein, of course, would argue that he was merely a product of a system, fortunate enough to escape the rigors of the Lutenpold Gymnasium before modern schooling strangled his insatiable curiosity. In a graduation speech, he claimed to not be an authority on the value of education, as many well-meaning men of all times have repeatedly expressed enough on those matters. Instead, he implored all of us to continue contributing to mankind's shared knowledge, stating that knowledge of truth alone does not suffice. On the contrary, this knowledge must continually be renewed by ceaseless effort, if it is not to be lost. It resembles a statue of marble, which stands in the desert and is continually threatened with burial by the shifting sand. The hands of service must ever be at work, in order that the marble continue lastingly to shine in the sun. He finished with the thought, "To these serving hands mine shall also belong." For more than 200 years, mankind understood the world through Newton's laws of the mechanical universe. Einstein showed us that there was more to it. While he didn't yet prove that God doesn't throw dice with the universe, he reshaped mankind's understanding of time and space. His unified field theory remains incomplete, but he would have left this earth with the utmost confidence that someone will come after him to further our understanding of the natural world. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod at Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.